welcome back, and we are honored to have back with us today Jonathan Tobin. He's the editor-in-chief of the Jewish News Syndicate and the host of The Top Story with Jonathan Tobin there on JNS. He's a senior contributor to The Federalist and columnist for the New York Post, Newsweek, and other outlets. And, of course, their website is jns.org, which stands for the Jewish News Syndicate, jns.org. You can check that out. Jonathan, good to see you again, friend. How are you?
Great to be back with you, Perry. Thank you.
Thank you for your time. So what happened to the ceasefire?
Well, the ceasefire ended because Hamas thought it could just string it out endlessly. There's no question that the Trump administration and Trump's envoy, Steve Witkoff, was interested in negotiating another phase of the ceasefire. But Hamas just thinks it has all the cards and all the time in the world, and it really doesn't have any intention of releasing all of the hostages, which is both the Israeli and the American position. And so Israel, with American support, is sending Hamas a message that its crimes will not go unpunished forever. It cannot hold on to these poor people indefinitely, as well as the corpses of those that they have murdered, and that if they want a ceasefire to continue, they have got to produce these hostages. They've got to release them. They are not in a position to be dictating terms to Israel or the United States, and that's why the ceasefire broke down.
Is this a change in Israel's position? It's kind of like we're done now. We're going for it.
I think to some extent it is. We have to understand Prime Minister Netanyahu is under, conflicting pressures. There is enormous pressure on him from the families of the hostages who are supported by Netanyahu's political opponents, somewhat cynically. And of course, we understand the family's position. If it were our loved ones, who wouldn't trade the whole world for a spouse, a child, a sibling? I mean, we understand that. But Netanyahu's responsibilities are to guard the whole nation of Israel and the Jewish people. And he's got to balance that with the need that if he does a deal with Hamas, that puts them in a position that they will stay in power in Gaza indefinitely. That's just a guarantee of more October 7th, more terrorisms, more atrocities, more people being taken hostage, more people being murdered. He can't allow that. Now, what's changed is not so much Netanyahu's position, but the position of the United States. From October 7th through January 20th of this year, the position of the United States was that Israel's got to keep making concessions, that it can't pursue the war against Hamas with the vigor it needs to take. And that, the Biden-Harris administration really hamstrung Israel's efforts to defeat Hamas. Netanyahu withstood that pressure pretty well, but, there were places he couldn't go. And the change is now that Trump's position is one of moral clarity. The statements from him and from Secretary of State Marco Rubio have made it clear that what Hamas has done will not be tolerated. Their efforts to hold on to these hostages indefinitely, to allow themselves to stay in power in Gaza indefinitely, will not be allowed. That's what's changed. And that's why Israel is doing what it needs to do.
So, this is a hard question, Jonathan, but so what incentive does Hamas have to release the hostages? Because at the end of the day, they won't be allowed to exist anymore.
That's an excellent question. And in the end, I'm not sure that anything will really work to motivate them to do the right thing and release these hostages. They don't care about their own people, let alone the Israelis whom they've kidnapped. They will hold on to power as long as possible. They think that the more people who get killed, especially, their own Palestinian people, the better their PR is. And to some extent, they aren't wrong. We see how the mainstream media in this country, never mind the rest of the world, treats Israel's efforts to eradicate Hamas. It the big lie about genocide and war crimes. They're looking for, they don't really want there to be a peaceful solution to this. They will never surrender power. They will never disarm. But I think in the past, the Biden administration, and to be fair, Trump and his envoy in the weeks before he took office, he was very eager to get good imagery on the day of the inauguration that there was a ceasefire. He pushed for a ceasefire on the terms that Biden had been pushing for, and that's the ceasefire that was agreed to in January. Now, I think the administration realizes, some people have been released, which is good. Obviously, we rejoice in that, as barbarous as Hamas's behavior in doing it has been. But I think the administration has come to the realization that we can only go so far with this, and that unless the next phase is, of these negotiations brings the release of all the hostages, Israel has a green light to resume its campaign to eradicate Hamas, which is the only long-term solution for Gaza and for the conflict. And the sooner that Hamas is completely defeated, and that ideas like President Trump's for rebuilding Gaza are allowed to start, to be considered seriously, and they can't be considered seriously until Hamas is completely defeated. There's really not that much to talk about, as much as Israel's going to keep negotiating as long as people are alive. The hostages are alive. As I said, there's really terrible pressure on Netanyahu to do whatever he can to save those lives, regardless of what it costs Israel. But in the end, the two goals of defeating Hamas and getting all the hostages out, the honest answer is that they're mutually exclusive. It's not going to, you can't have both. And the right thing for Israel is to defeat Hamas. That's a terrible thing to say. That's a hard thing to say to the hostage families, because we want them all to, we're praying for them. We want them to be released, these hostages. But, they are the insurance. They are the leverage that Hamas thinks it has, but they can't be allowed to continue in power there.
I think what makes this so difficult, and I want to say this respectfully, we in the West don't understand the mentality of a death cult. We don't get that. But when you look at the numbers, of 59 remaining, 24 are alive and 35 are dead. The numbers are going in the wrong direction. And they don't care about human life. So the only question I have at the moment is, what happened to the Houthis in Yemen? Did that send any kind of a signal to Hamas?
I don't know that, listen, Hamas's leadership doesn't care what happens in Yemen. They don't care what happens to the Houthis. They honestly, as I said before, they don't care what happens to their own people. They want to see more of their own people killed because they think it's good for them. That's how sick that is. And you're right to label it as a death cult. It is a death cult. The trouble with the conflict between Israel and the Palestinian Arabs, it's not one about territory. If it had been about territory, it would have been over a generation ago. Israel was, Israel tried in the 90s with the Oslo Accords to trade land for peace, and it got land for terror instead. That's the problem. The Palestinian national identity is, unfortunately, inextricably tied up with a century-old war against the Jews, against Zionism, against the right of the Jews to live in their ancient homeland. Until that changes, and it can only change once the Palestinians realize they've been completely defeated and they have to change. They have to change their whole way of thinking, much as the Germans did in the spring of 1945, when they were defeated and their nation, their cities were nothing but rubble. It was time to move on from the Nazi cult of death. It's time for the Palestinians to move on from their cult of death. But unfortunately, unlike in 1945, the rest of the world is cheering them on, telling them, don't give up. They have their supporters. They have, people in this country, like the Hamas supporter who was organizing anti-Semitic pro-Hamas demonstrations at Columbia University, my alma mater. He's a hero to the left in the United States. Even the Democratic Party is trying to get him out, against President Trump's justified effort to deport him. That's why the Palestinians are holding on. That the rest of the world is telling them, you're in the right, Israel's in the wrong. It's a bizarro kind of moral formulation, and it's utterly immoral. But that's why they think, crazy as it may seem, after all the destruction in Gaza, after all the people who have been killed, Hamas thinks it's winning. They have to be convinced that they're not winning, and they aren't.
One last question before I take a break, Jonathan. I think we're all in a shock to find out how complicit Egypt became in all of this. I mean, the tunnels start there, and they were huge tunnels that supplied Hamas, and yet Egypt won't let the Palestinians come over there and find refuge. Were you surprised by this?
A little. I think we've always known, those of us who follow this, always known that there was smuggling from Egypt. I think many of us thought it wasn't as large scale as it has turned out to be, that there wasn't, as we have subsequently learned, so much trafficking between Gaza and Egypt. Hamas makes money from that. Egypt makes money from that. It's discouraging because ostensibly the president of Egypt, General Sisi, has been allied with Israel against his foe, the Muslim Brotherhood, which is the organization from which Hamas sprung. But the culture of Egypt is still very, most Egyptians are still very anti-Israel, very anti-Semitic, not to put too fine a point on it. And I think he has sort of, as Mubarak did, even though he was part of a government that formally was at peace with Israel, it was a cold peace. And I think the pressure on Sisi, it's not about human rights. It's a very brutal regime, but he is feeling this pressure. And I think the peace with Egypt has grown much colder too, even though, it's their blockade. People blame Israel for blockading Gaza. It's Egypt too, but Hamas, certainly the Sisi government is complicit in Hamas's survival, and they do so for their own domestic political reasons.
Yeah. All right, let me take a quick break. Let me say to our viewers and listeners, JNS.org stands for the Jewish News Syndicate. That's the website. There's the picture of the landing page. Check out his host of the Top Story with Jonathan Tobin there on the JNS website as well. We'll take a quick break. We'll be right back. Welcome back, and an honor to have back with us today Jonathan Tobin. He's the editor-in-chief of the Jewish News Syndicate, also the host of Top Story with Jonathan Tobin. He's a senior contributor to the Federalist and the columnist for New York Post, Newsweek, and other outlets. The website, jns.org. There's the picture of the landing page. So, Jonathan, all right, I nickname or at least describe Hamas being a death cult. You could add to that Hezbollah, Houthis, and what's happening in Syria. Sooner or later, we have to deal with Iran, and maybe with the approval of Saudi Arabia. How far out do you think that is?
I can't give you a firm answer on that because right now, the United States, the Trump administration, is exploring the possibility of talks with Iran. The president wants to give the Iranians an exit ramp before he ramps up sanctions even harder on them. An attempt to get them to give up their nuclear program and stop their support for terrorism. I'm frankly extremely skeptical about the prospect of such negotiations, even though obviously it would be in Iran's interest to do so. But they're not doing it because for the same reasons they strung along Obama and the Biden administrations. Their goal is a war on the West, not to as in Obama's words, get right with the rest of the world. They don't care about that. That's why they launched this 7-front war against Israel in the last 2 years. Um, their goals are very different. But of course, there are ways to pressure them. Their economy is very weak. It was revived by Biden's relaxation of sanctions. Once we get back to really tough sanctions, and not just sanctions on them, but making it clear to their European trading partners that if you do business with Iran, you won't do business with the United States. Making it clear to China as well, because the Chinese are major enablers of all of this because they buy 90% of Iran's oil. They have kept that corrupt, brutal, tyrannical regime afloat, imposing its harsh rule on its own people, as well as making mischief throughout the region. Despite the many setbacks they've gotten in the last year from the defeat of their auxiliaries, Hezbollah in Lebanon, the fall of the Assad government, which was a real blow to Iran because he was their ally and even puppet. Their Russian allies have been distracted by the war in Ukraine. So there are ways to pressure Iran. But I think for now, the Trump administration has been telling Israel, don't attack Iran yet. I think they may eventually change their mind about that once Trump realizes that his effort to make a deal with them will fail, as it inevitably will. But that's where we're heading with that issue.
Is it possible that suggested talks are nothing more than a decoy?
Well, I don't attempt to read the president's mind, or when our liberal friends do that, they always fail, and I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole. Certainly, Trump believes in the art of the deal, and he has been known to troll both friends and adversaries. Perhaps it's a decoy, but I think actually Trump would like there to be. He doesn't want more wars, and I understand that, and I applaud that. I mean, the American people don't want wars. They don't want to be funding wars. They don't want to be participating in wars, except when it's for their own, to defend our national interest. Now, obviously, it's in our interest for Iran not to be making, causing instability in the world, attacking international shipping in the Red Sea, as they do through the Houthis, attacking our allies, undermining both Saudi Arabia and Israel. He'd like to avoid more conflict. I think he's going to play out, it's there are cards in his hands. He's going to play those cards. But I think history teaches us that the Iranians aren't interested in giving up their, I don't believe there's almost any circumstance under which they would give up their nuclear program. I don't think that there's even less chance that they would give up their support for terrorism, because that's at the heart of the Islamist creed, which motivates that regime. They're about endless war against the West, not just Israel, but against all of us in the West. Big Satan U.S. as well as little Satan Israel. I think, as much as I understand the president's desire to come to some kind of agreement, that's not going to work. And I think he will find that out sooner or later.
Okay, so in some ways, the question, is being answered in the affirmative. But and what I mean by that is because the president, on the other hand, has been very adamant, and that is Iran cannot have a nuke. And the only way you stop Iran from not having a nuke is to take out the nukes. There's no other way.
There was another way. I don't know that still is that option is still open. Listen, every American president since George W. Bush has made that same vow. But the trouble is, had Trump been reelected in 2020 and continued with his maximum pressure program against Iran, the Iranian economy would have been brought to its knees. It was almost there anyway. Biden revived it. Negotiations. But in the intervening 4 years, Iran has gotten through cheating and through the weak terms of the nuclear deal that Obama negotiated in the first place. They've gotten really close to a nuclear weapon. Just the week before the October 7th attacks on Israel, the Department of Defense dropped a Friday afternoon news dump in which they revealed that Iran was only 10 days away from having enough material to make a nuclear bomb. Well, that was a year and a half ago. They are already a threshold nuclear power. And so, yes, at this point, the only way to take out their nuclear program is to take it out, is through force. That's unfortunate. Frankly, that should have happened a long time ago. Obama prevented Israel from doing so over a decade ago. Right now, that is probably the prospect. But we'll see what happens. Obviously, President Trump wants a good outcome here. Israel will trust him to come to his own conclusion in good time. And when that happens, I think we know what the outcome will be.
One other question in that arena, and that is the citizens of Iran would like to see a regime change. And you've heard of Israel talking about a regime change. If there was a regime change, that'd put a huge pause in the nuclear program, wouldn't it?
Well, in theory, yes. And you're right. The Iranian, the regime is deeply unpopular. It's a terrible, tyrannical, it's a failed government. But, it's kind of an iron rule of history that tyrannies don't fall until they lose their taste for blood, until they are no longer willing to slaughter their own people in the numbers needed to maintain their grip on power. Unfortunately, the Iranian regime and its Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps that props it up and controls much of its economy, they've shown no sign of being willing to give up power or to allow any rebel movement to succeed. It's kind of up to the Iranian people to topple their government. It would be very hard to do so from the outside and to have any good outcome, as the United States has learned to its sorrow in Afghanistan and Iraq. We're not in the democracy promotion business anymore, rightfully. Yeah. But a regime change would be ideal, but that's got to come from within Iran. That's not something that can be imposed from the outside in any productive way, I think.
Just maybe a personal comment from you. Israel's still standing.
Thank God.
Thank God. And it's now being reinforced with a new relationship with the United States, or at least a meaningful one. That's pretty amazing, isn't it?
Well, as a journalist, I deal in what is, I like to think, my priority is to report and comment on the things that are happening and not to engage in magical thinking. But the truth is, I've always been, a short-term pessimist, long-term optimist. Mm-hmm. Israel, I have perfect faith, as would say in Hebrew, emunah shalema, perfect faith that Israel will survive and thrive and go on with God's help. It survived tough times, difficult allies, unfaithful allies, and people like Barack Obama and Joe Biden. It is being strengthened by the support it gets from Donald Trump and from his government and from the vast majority of the American people. But it will survive. It is still standing. People have been predicting its demise since since the modern state of Israel was reborn in 1948. It's going nowhere. Mm-hmm. The Zionist visionary Zev Jabotinsky wrote 100 years ago that the Jewish people would survive, the Zionist project would thrive through the building of an iron wall that would convince its enemies that it cannot be defeated. That iron wall was shaken on October 7th, but it is still standing. Israel isn't going anywhere. Israel will not be defeated by Hamas, by Iran, by Barack Obama or Joe Biden or all the leftists at all the college campuses in this country or anywhere else in the world. Israel's going nowhere. And its enemies are going to have to learn to live with it. And that's the way it's going to be. And with God's help, that will continue.
Amen to that. Do you think, given all that we talked about, and I only got about a minute left, a big question, but eventually the UN's proven to be useless.
Worse than useless.
Yeah. I mean,
counterproductive. It's the worst. It's exactly the opposite of what its founders envisioned it to be after World War II.
it's actually become an enemy of Israel.
It is an enemy. It's a cesspool of anti-Semitism. It is, along with many other these multilateral global organizations, it's, profoundly anti-Semitic, profoundly anti-American. I am hopeful that the Trump administration is going to be enacting policies that will ensure that if it survives, it's not going to be with American funds. And I hope that President Trump pursues this, because these institutions are fundamentally anti-American, never mind just anti-Israel.
JNS.org. That's Jonathan's website. Stands for the Jewish News Syndicate. JNS.org. There's the picture of the landing page. Very, very resourceful. Jonathan, my friend, thank you for your time. We value it greatly. God bless you. Have a super day.
Great. Thanks very much.